Oh, hello there, Prynhawn da Croeso. Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in our World Social Work Month webinar series. And today's is Working Together to Safeguard Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Children and Families. I'm Alison Humes and I'm the National Director for Wales at the British Association of Social Workers, and I'm also one of the co-founding members of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Social Work Association. And I'll just hand you over to my co-presenter so that he can introduce himself.
Hello everybody, my name is Dan Allen. I'm a social work academic. My work is exclusively focused on developing and raising social work practice with Gypsy, Roma traveller communities. I'm an active involved member of the fairly recently formed Gypsy, Roma Traveller Social Work Association.
Thank you, Dan. So before we begin the presentation, I just want to let you know that there is going to be an opportunity throughout the presentation for you to ask some questions. So there'll be a couple of pauses so that we can answer questions. So if I could encourage you to use the chat box, we'll make sure that we're monitoring them as we go through the presentation. And also, I think it's important to reflect that for many of you attending today, and also thank you for choosing to attend this webinar. This is going to be, we hope, a start of a journey in learning about, the historical, the present day, structural disadvantage and oppression and racism experienced by Romani and traveller people in the UK. And for social work as a profession which is underpinned with a code of ethics rooted in human rights, and it's absolutely vital that social workers understand the impact of disadvantage and racism and how it affects Gypsy, Roma and traveller families and our work with them. And this is why, if we move to the next slide, please, Steph. So this is why we wanted to start the presentation with this particular slide. So this is a quote by Chelsea Mcdonough, and Chelsea Mcdonough is from a London traveller family, and she is currently, it says she's an MA student at King's College London, but I have to say that she does have her master's degree, and she's now the education policy lead at the Travellers Movement. So well done and congratulations to Chelsea, and you'll see why that's a really impressive achievement as we go through the presentation. So, Chelsea has said, you will have anti-Gypsy Roma traveller prejudices and biases. You aren't to be blamed for it, but acknowledge your biases, do the work to unpick them, engage with Gypsy Roma traveller organisations and activities, read widely to actively combat anti-Gypsy Roma traveller media and stereotypes. And I think really what she's doing is she's inviting us to reflect on our prejudices, to be honest, to have an open mind, and to educate ourselves and each other. And I think and I hope that's what you're doing today. So at this point, I'll hand over to Dan.
Thanks. Next slide, please. When we start thinking about the important messages that Al's just outlined and the reason why we need to think carefully and critically about social work practice with Gypsy, Roma traveller communities and all communities who are marginalised and oppressed by racism and injustice, it's important that we begin to develop a contextual understanding of who Gypsy, Roma traveller people are. So very briefly on this slide, I've covered some fairly key topics that are pertinent and important to understand the context and the history, almost the community psychology of Gypsy, Roma traveller communities. Understanding some of the challenges that communities can face in the present, it's important that we understand that some of those challenges echo in injustices that have been meted out in the past. It's important to recognise that Gypsy, Roma traveller communities are established communities, communities who were protected under equality legislation and duty. And here we see that we have records of traveling communities in this country going back as far as Roman times. Moving up through history, we have records of traveling blacksmiths in the 1100s. What we start to see, though, as we move into the 15th century, are waves of anti-Gypsy Roma traveller legislation, waves of legislation that begin to form a public opinion and public antipathy towards communities of people. So there in 1498, we see the the beginning of emergence of state violence towards Gypsy people. In those days were called Egyptians, and it's the term Egyptian that gives us the name Gypsy today. Often thought because people presenting in the country with a dark complexion were assumed to have come from that area of the world. Of course, the history of Gypsy Roma traveller people is far richer and far more detailed than I can capture on this slide. So as we were encouraged in the previous slide to think about how we can develop our understanding of Gypsy Roma traveller communities, of course, your opportunity to understand history in your own time is clearly important. Moving then into 1530, we see and 1554, we see the Egyptian Act. Here then we see the beginning of anti-immigration legislation. Essentially, Egyptians, who we know as Gypsies, were forbidden to enter England. Those that were living in England were either deported or put into slavery. Egyptians coming to this country from Europe were punished, put to death. Those ships and vessels that people travelled to this country on were often confiscated by the crown, and ship captains were put into prison. Here we then see a community of firsts who, because in 1530, they are the first community of people we see to prohibit and enable anti-human rights legislation. A community of firsts, the examples of state-sanctioned violence towards a community that have echoes into the present. If we think about some of the Brexit policy, particularly those from those more right-wing political action groups, where they would show images of Roma communities and use the basis of that imagery to try and formulate public opinion and public hostility that has basis and genesis here, the 15th and 16th century. Since that time, communities have faced tremendous hardships, hostility, and examples of cultural genocide. Moving through history then to 1889, we see the Movable Dwellings Bill that enabled concerned individuals to enter caravans to check for moral irregularities. A community of first then, where we see the Movable Dwellings Bill being almost a blueprint, a foundation for some contemporary examples of child protection legislation and duty. Through into the Second World War and the Paragimos, the devourings. As records show, over 600,000 Gypsy Roma traveller communities put to death because of the extent of hatred and hostility and racism towards them. Since then, throughout history, communities begin to continue to experience enormous amounts of pressure and hostility. Enormous amounts of hostility and pressure that impact directly on life experiences and life expectancy, on health determinants of health and health inequality, of social inequalities too. It was in the 1998 and 2000s then that Gypsy Roma traveller communities appealed to court and using the Mandela criteria to show that they have protected characteristics that should be protected under then race relation legislation and duty, and now equality legislation and duty. Proven so and recognised as discrete ethnic minority groups because of the history that I can only begin to show on the slide here. My point then, the takeaway point, is that when we start to think about social work practice with Gypsy Roma traveller communities, we have to understand the context within which people perceive social work and the way that social workers perceive communities too, and how, in some cases, those perceptions are informed by centuries of anti-Gypsy Roma traveller legislation, some of which is included here. Next slide, please. So in the UK, these are the predominant main groups of people who come under the term Gypsy Roma traveller, often defined as GRT or reduced to GRT, but those sort of acronyms, a little bit like LGBT or BME, can be generally unhelpful because they don't necessarily include all of those people who are often ascribed to that label. Here then we'll see, starting at 12 o'clock, Romani Gypsies or Romani English Gypsies, protected under equality legislation and duty. We have Irish travellers, protected as an ethnic minority group in the same way. Scottish travellers, Scottish Gypsies and Welsh travellers, equally protected as an ethnic minority group, and so too are Roma. Those communities then, those 5 communities are distinct and often distinguish themselves carefully from one another. New travellers, circus people, boat people, and fairground and show people aren't currently recognised as an ethnic minority group and therefore protected under relevant legislation. Those communities of people haven't been to court to argue that their culture, traditions and heritage can be applied to the Mandela criteria, although all of those communities could do. If we think about fairground and show people, the movable dwellings bill was so important because that formed the Showman's Guild. So we can clearly see that the communities of people have a rich history and heritage within the UK. Because of the time that we have to talk about this massive important topic and the differences that exist, I'd encourage you to, as we said, to do some reading and some background research. And the book that I wrote with Paul Adams on social work with Gypsy Roma traveller children is a recommended potential place for you to start to understand and develop your understanding of this topic. Next slide, please. Are there any questions on the things we've asked so far? Sorry.
I'm just having a look in the chat. So we do have a couple of questions, Dan. So if I can, so someone has put, I had no knowledge of this history, and how does it affect Gypsies and travellers in the UK, particularly the Paraimos, the Holocaust?
Okay, understanding how the injuries that have been caused by state-sanctioned violence, and the worst case example of the Paraimos during the Holocaust, we have to understand the way that communities perceive potential agents of the state and social workers who may have been complicit in the organisation and categorisation and the causing the injuries that have been sustained. That we recognise that people have a perception and view of social work and social workers, and we have to understand with sympathy and empathy what it means for those communities when we become involved and how they might perceive the actions of social workers. Understanding that then is important because it enables us to begin to think about having conversations with families about the perceptions of social workers, about the perceptions of society more generally, so that we can begin to understand the intersectional impact of racism, of discrimination, of injustice, of hostility, of social exclusion, of significant health inequalities and social determinants of those types of concerns that might raise our awareness to child welfare. That unless we contextualise the lives of the people who we're working to support within their history, we can only really pay lip service to the multi-issues that they face. Understanding who communities are is key to understanding community psychology and the relationship between social work and the communities who we're working to support.
I think I just wanted to add one small thing there, Dan, just in terms of you know, how close and how relevant the Romani and Roma and Sinti Holocaust, you know, feels to some families, to Gypsy and traveller families within the UK. I don't know if any of our attendees are aware that, you know, before Hitler planned to invade the UK, and before the invasion, you know, a list of the Gypsy and traveller families within the UK was compiled, and that list, you know, was compiled with the intention to, you know, send them to the you know, the gas chambers, and, you know, to be exterminated in the Holocaust. And, you know, for two founder members of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Association, you know, we're told in our families that our family names were on that list. So, you know, it's still within living memory, you know, that fear for so many of the, you know, the families within the UK.
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Steph. So now we're going to take, you know, a bit of a closer look on, you know, some of the structural barriers that make Romani and traveller people more vulnerable to social exclusion. And we know that Gypsy, traveller and Roma people are amongst some of the most disadvantaged in the country, and they have particularly poor outcomes in key areas such as health and education. And, you know, we know that good health and good education are key sort of foundational stones, you know, key foundational building blocks for life. And we've just, well, we're still living through a pandemic, and we know that you know, particularly in relation to health and education, they have both been disproportionately impacted by this current pandemic. We also know that Gypsies and travellers have the lowest rate of economic activity of any ethnic group. So that's 47% as compared to 63% for non-Gypsy and traveller populations. And again, this has been impacted, you know, quite severely by the pandemic. So traditional, you know, activities that you know, some workers will be employed in simply weren't able to be undertaken during the pandemic, which has created, you know, increased economic harm. But also, I think we can't underestimate, you know, the psychological harm of in terms of identity and not being able to provide, you know, for your family. The 2011 census, you know, also tells us that 26% of those census respondents who were economically inactive were either disabled or had long-term ill health. And again, this is the highest proportion across all ethnic groups. So, you know, we knew very little of the support needs of people within the communities that have a disability until very recently, actually. And Dr. Peter Unwin and Becky Meakin undertook some recent research, which is called, you know, Hidden Lives of Gypsies and Travellers with a Disability. And we'll make sure that you have a link to that research. You know, it's participatory research, and there are some really powerful videos of community members talking about, you know, the impact of disadvantage and discrimination with a disability. Thanks, Steph. Can you move to the next slide, please? So, one of the key problems with the 2011 census is there's an undercount. So, you know, we don't have a clear indication of the size of the, you know, Gypsy and traveller populations within the UK. And, you know, that causes, you know, that creates, you know, huge difficulties in terms of allocating resources in policy development and understanding the distinct support needs of the populations. But, you know, so we know that the census in 2011 is now upon us, and, you know, lots of NGOs have been doing some really fantastic work in supporting the communities in registering for the census and self-identifying in the census. But really, I wanted to read out to you something which appeared on social media yesterday from an activist within the community. I think it highlights, you know, some of the conflict that you know is there within the communities. So what this activist said was, let's talk census. I know I should tick the Gypsy box, but every moral fibre in me says no, don't identify. In the UK, we are persecuted daily, and the world is so strange right now. What's next for us? What's round the corner? Especially since Priti Patel's racist law was published. What if she's the next Prime Minister? I just can't try and convince my own people to identify officially. We know that only 58,000 identified last time, and we desperately need recognition. 1930s Germany is a constant reminder. I know I'm out publicly, but I just can't give a convincing argument to the community as to why we should complete the census. For the government to support us better, fairer funding and policies, what protection is there from this government if we do identify? So I think that's a really powerful insight into some of the conflicts there, a real sense that there are incredibly important reasons to identify, but also linked to some of the history that Dan was talking about, those centuries of persecution, some real fears about about being identified. So what else did the 2011 census tell us? Well, it tells us that those who did identify in the census are young. It's a young population, and again, that has implications in terms of education, in terms of employment, and in terms of housing needs. But there's also some have wondered if the age of the population is so low because of the poor life expectancy. So we know that the average life expectancy of Gypsy traveller populations in the UK is estimated around 10 to 12 years below that of other white UK citizens, and that the average health status of a 60-year-old Gypsy traveller person is similar to that of the average 80-year-old white person in the UK. So that really amplifies the disadvantages in terms of health within the communities. Thank you, Steph. Can you go on to the next? So, low educational attainment is a real concern, within Gypsy and traveller children. And we know that they have, poorer educational outcomes across all of the key stages in education. And of course, again, I think I mentioned earlier that this again has been disproportionately impacted during the pandemic. And some of the reasons, around low educational attainment is connected to being evicted, so moved on, not being able to settle, for a long period within a school. It's connected a bit to a nomadic lifestyle, traditionally leaving school at a younger age, but overwhelmingly there's more and more research around the impact of bullying in schools, and that's a real driver for disruption in education. And young people who've been interviewed as part of research into the impact of bullying have said that teachers fail to identify that they're being bullied, and they fail to act on that bullying. And the other thing that children and young people say is they see no representation of themselves in schools. So they don't see teachers who are from the communities, and they're not taught their history. They don't see anything about their culture or contributions to society. Thank you. Can I have the next slide, please, Steph? So if Romani and traveller children have disruption to their primary and secondary education, is there any wonder that such low numbers get into higher education? So again, it's 3 to 4% of the Gypsy Roma and traveller population, as compared to 43% in the general population. And I was going to say there is some light at the end of this tunnel, because recently there's been we've seen an uptake in the numbers of children who remain in education, and also there's been increasing numbers of older members of the community who are accessing higher education. And I think what's really heartening and interesting about this is they're being motivated and gaining confidence from community work and community activism. And some of those people are entering social work, which is fantastic. But we have to mentor and support them in remaining within the profession. And another initiative to support Gypsy and traveller people entering higher education and remaining in higher education is a pledge which has been developed by Bucks New Uni, and it asks, so those universities that sign up to the pledge have to do certain things to create an inclusive and a supportive and a mentoring environment for community members to feel that university is the place for them. And the Gypsy Roma and Traveller Social Work Association, along with BASWA and Joint University Council and Social Work Education, are all collaboratively supporting and promoting that pledge into higher education. Could I have the next slide, please, Steph? So, in the last slide, in terms of disruption to children's education, I talked a little bit about bullying, and one manifest. So bullying is a hate crime, and there's lots of current, very recent research into the impact of hate crime on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people, and it's been described as it's as regular as rain. So it happens all of the time, and one of the reports has actually been called as regular as rain. And emerging from that research is some evidence that there is a real correlation between experiencing hate crime and also the high rates of suicide within the GRT population. And what we know is that the suicide rates are 6 times higher than that of non-Gypsy Roma traveller populations, which is just it's just an appalling statistic. Could I have the next slide, please, Steph? So here are some quotes that came out of the most recent report, Hate as Regular as Rain. I mean, I'm not going to read them. I'll just leave them there for a few seconds for you to look at them. And I've got to apologise if my voice is going. I've developed a spring cold, so many apologies for my croaky voice. So if we could move on to the next slide now, please, Steph. So, what's the problem? I think we've described really lots of the problems, and I think some of the early research in social work found that where there was social work intervention, it wasn't around supporting the communities. It was very much linked to punitive action by the state, enforcement action, eviction. And is it any wonder then that the result of that has been low trust between Gypsy, Roma and traveller populations and social work and other state agencies? If we could go to the next slide, please. So one of the sort of primary reasons for social work is to become involved with Gypsy, Roma and traveller families is neglect, and that neglect, as we've spoken about in the other slides, is overwhelmingly associated, with poverty, with a lack of knowledge of health and welfare systems, but a lack of fair access to health and welfare systems. And we know that social work intervention, when it's happened, it's a result of usually punitive action by the state. And is it any wonder then that families say that they haven't found the interventions supportive, and they fail to address those key structural barriers that community members face, such as poor housing, poverty, and poor health. Thank you. If we could have the next slide, please. So one of the reasons that, you know, we set up the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Social Work Association was our concerns about the lack of social work, you know, education and training. So social work with Romani and Traveller families, anti-Gypsyism is not a standard part of social work education and training. You know, if you have it, then, you know, it's on an ad hoc basis, and it's not integrated, and it's not embedded at undergraduate level, and it's not embedded throughout, you know, professional development. And another, you know, key problem is the lack of, you know, representation within the workforce. So there are very few social workers who are from either, you know, a Gypsy, Roma or Traveller background. And I think it's next slide and questions. Do we have any?
Yeah, we do, Al. Yeah. So one of the questions goes back to understanding how can social workers understand the differences between communities and the importance of those differences in relation to social work.
So I think the most important way to understand the differences is to do your research. So, you know, the information is there, and it's really important, you know, to do that. So do the work, do the research, understand the information that's available to you. If you could also, you know, there are NGOs that have, you know, fantastic information, historical information, and of course, you know, the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Social Work Association, you know, will also be a source of, you know, a robust and reliable information. But, you know, part of being a social worker is to ask questions, isn't it? So if you don't know, ask. Don't make assumptions. Ask, and ask in a way, you know, that is respectful. And if you know, if you ask then in the right way, then you know, those answers, you know, will be given to you. So key messages are: do your homework. You know, the information is there. Go find it. But also, if you're not sure, then you know, you must ask, you know, the family that you're working with how they self-identify and how they want to be addressed.
Yeah, those points are absolutely key. There was some important advice came out of the Roma support group that talked about particular sensitivity when working with Roma communities, and not referring to them as Gypsy, because in some in Romanesque, some of the language that Roma people speak, without careful sensitivity from potential interpreters, the word Gypsy translated into Romanesque literally means dirty. So we need to be careful in terms of understanding sensitivities. The combination then of Gypsy and Roma becomes particularly important if we think about some of the ethnic categories that are used on our data collection forms, including previous census. The Department of Education in England, for example, put Gypsy / Roma as the same ethnic group without recognising that they are two distinct ethnicities. There's two questions here, Al, that talk about education and the point you mentioned about young people leaving education, the potential perception linked to a safeguarding risk around forced marriages and child development more generally. But then the question was, how can we work with communities to encourage participation in education?
So, you know, again, the focus is on the communities that need to change. So I think I would flip the question and say, what can we do as a society to create, you know, environments where children and young people from the communities, you know, are able to engage in education which they value and they want, where, you know, they don't feel bullied, they don't feel they're not subjected to hate speech, and they feel that they see themselves. They see teachers who are from their community, taught by teachers who are from their communities. They're taught about, you know, their own histories as standard parts of the teaching that happens within a curriculum. So I think for me, it's, you know, what does society have to do, and not necessarily, you know, not what the communities have to do. Yeah, because the communities that, you know, value, I think it's a stereotype, isn't it? down that it's a myth that needs busting, that the communities don't value education. Well, they do value education, but again, I think we have to stress that we they also other skills are equally valuable. So if young people are particularly talented, with manual skills, with their hands, with crafting, again, we have to value these equally also.
Yeah, absolutely. And the work that charitable organisations are conducting, so Friends, Family and Travellers, for example, the Traveller Movement, Roma Support Group and various other organisations focus specifically on education inclusion, health inclusion, reducing those disparities. I think the challenge we have in social work is understanding where that information is and bringing it together as an example of evidence-informed practice, and that's something that the Gypsy Roma Travellers Social Work Association is keen to do. Just one question before we move on to the next few slides, if that's all right, Al. Somebody's mentioned a question here about local authorities taking a particularly aggressive stance to evict families who are camping unlawfully or camping on unauthorised campsites. We currently believe that there's around a third of the community, because of significant challenges within housing policy and no real political obligation or will to provide social housing for communities in the way that they would do for other groups, is that around a third of the community are living on unauthorised campsites. And that can be very challenging for lots of reasons, particularly in terms of accessibility, the services that you and I take for granted, but also then as a potential indicator of risk in our social work assessments, it becomes important. Anyway, somebody's asked what can they do to change and advocate for that, to prevent people being evicted or potentially criminalised for the situation that they are forced to be in because of lack of political movement or social policy systems. I was involved as an independent social worker, working specifically with these communities in and around eviction. And what I was able to do as a social worker for the first time was bring in assessments that combined the Children Act, the Care Act and mental health legislation, and present a full holistic impact assessment to local authorities and to courts, and bringing to bear the full knowledge to look at the impact of eviction on the lives of children and vulnerable adults. We were able to overturn some eviction, and some people who have been threatened with imprisonment for unlawful residing on unauthorised campsites. So I just used the tools that were available to us, but what I was able to do was combine all three, so we had a full and holistic understanding of the challenges that families face. The art of the possible, really. We have all the tools that can make significant impact on the lives of the people who we're working to support, and we should do that wherever we can too.
I was going to say, and I think where you have local authorities with large populations, of either Gypsy, Roma, or traveller families, these should be incorporated into social work assessment, so that there is a particular model of assessment for working with the family that incorporates that that holistic approach. That's a human rights approach, so that the language and the narrative can be properly captured.
Absolutely. Can we move on? Should we move on to the next slide, Al? What do you reckon?
Yeah.
Next slide, please, Steph. Okay, so we have sense then of the relationship, the developing sense of the relationship between social workers and Gypsy Roma traveller communities. In 2008, I worked with Sarah Riding from the University of Salford, and we interviewed 150 child protection social workers. They had to be in post for at least 2 years so that they were managing caseloads themselves. Some experienced social workers, consultant social workers, principal social workers, team managers made up that cohort. And during those interviews, I asked them to think about their experiences of working to support Gypsy Roma traveller communities. But before I did that, I got them to think about the perception of what it meant, the symbolism of social work with Gypsy Roma traveller communities. So before I started to think specifically about the relationship that they had based upon their experiences of safeguarding Gypsy Roma traveller children, I engaged them in the following activity. So I started off by saying, imagine that you've come to work on a Monday and there was a referral from the police about a domestic disturbance that may have happened over the weekend, and you've been asked on Monday morning to go and conduct a safe and welfare check at the following property. And I showed them an image that's very similar to the one on the next slide, please. So I asked them to think about what they were thinking, how they were feeling, and how their thoughts and feelings might impact on their social work practice. What do you think they said? Well, they said, hang on, Dan, you're trying to trick me. What? This is normal. This is business as usual. There's, you know, I'd be thinking that I have a statutory obligation to protect the to assess the welfare of this child, to verify the accuracy of the referral and the police concern. But I'm not feeling particularly anxious. I'm not feeling particularly worried. I see the yellow lines outside the house, so I might be worried about where I'm going to park the car. But other than that, you know, it's pretty standard, Dan. This is our bread and butter stuff. We deal with this every day. I asked them the same question and showed them this slide. Next slide, please. What do you think they said? They said that they would be feeling scared, that they would be worried about their personal safety, that they would be worried about animals, they would be worried that they wouldn't be able to find the family. They thought that they might experience hostility and aggression. They thought that they would be unwanted. They felt intimidated, they felt anxious, they felt scared. So when we started to think about how those thoughts and feelings might impact on social work practice, they began to think that they may act in a more punitive way than they would do in the first example. This picture, by the way, is an authorised campsite in Liverpool. It's about 15 miles away from where I am right now. People living on this site pay the same. It's an authorised, so it's owned by a housing association. So, you know, it's the same terms and conditions of any housing or association property applies. They apply here. The importance then of understanding the way that social workers think and feel about social work practice and how their thoughts and feelings impact upon the way they do social work practice was important. Now I recognise and absolutely understand that not all Gypsy Roma traveller people live on a campsite. Because of the significant pressures that lots of families are under, most are forced to or choose to go and live in a house because it's easier, because there's no fear of persecution. There's easier access to the resources and facilities, including education, that you and I take for granted. But the image was present even if the word Gypsy Roma traveller appeared on a referral. That reading a word on a referral from a police officer or from a health visitor or from any other allied professional relating to safeguarding concern, the word created an image of a conceptual gypsy that was associated with terms like criminal behaviour, a flight risk, non-engagement, or disguised compliance. How those words then seen on a referral could lead to pathologizing reactions where a perception of risk was seen to be higher because of the word. Here then, social workers assume that Gypsy Roma travelling children would be at more risk of harm than children of any other group without even knocking on the front door. And it's that point of perception that's so important and relates to that earlier question that Al asked. Why is understanding the history, the context of people important to help us understand the effectiveness and power of social work practice? Next slide, please. This is what some of the social workers said when I asked them, Sarah and I asked them to reflect on their practice. Al, would you read them out for us, please?
I will do, yeah. So if I'm asked to work with a Gypsy family, I will be afraid and have low confidence in my ability to dig deep and to carry out a detailed assessment. I would be so fearful of getting through the front door, and if I thought that the parents will become more aggressive, my ambition will be to get the kids out. Okay. Domestic abuse can be common in the Gypsy and traveller culture. Statistics suggest that Gypsy, Roma and traveller children are 3 times more likely to experience domestic abuse. They are also culturally close-knit, less likely to report domestic abuse or ask for help because of what will be felt within their communities. To me, that is scary, a major risk.
Thanks, Al. Here then, there are clearly significant messages for how social work perceives the process and function of child protection with Gypsy Roma traveller communities. We're often reminded or encouraged to assume the worst, and we're also encouraged to think about how we feel. And, you know, work of prolific child protection academics say that if you feel scared, then the children who you're working to protect must feel scared too. But we need to think about the context of that advice. How a professional's own fear can be used to justify statutory intervention, whether there are serious or verified or substantiated concerns about the welfare of the child, excluding, of course, the perception of the family and excluding any effort or appreciative inquiry to understand what life is like through the eyes of the child. In the second example, we're seeing research that talks about low life expectancy, research that talks about social exclusion, research that talks about high suicide rates, research that talks about school exclusion, low attainment rates, that talk about low immunisation. The whole COVID campaign is of significant importance right now. But using that research to highlight, of course, chronic elements of discrimination and disparity, to form a judgment without saying maybe understand that these are some of the concerns that exist. But my job as a social worker is to verify the accuracy of these concerns and understand the potential impact of others' family, rather than we see a clear example of confirmation bias. And this research wasn't undertaken 2 decades ago. It was undertaken with colleagues who are practicing right now. Next slide, please. So what next? We're starting to see evidence that Gypsy Roma traveller children are disproportionately represented in child protection and child welfare systems. Research taken from the Department of Education school population census, and compare that to the DFE data on the involvement of child protection services, suggests that last year, 2 out of 10 Irish traveller children were subject to an initial referral. 2 out of 10. We recognise a significant increase in the number of Gypsy traveller children being wrenched from their families and placed in transracial placements or in residential care, and those numbers continue to increase at a disproportionate level, and so much so that there are disproportionate numbers of Gypsy Roma traveller children living in care compared to children from all other ethnic groups. And what we have then is this paradox: social workers who subscribe to the Basel Code of Ethics, who subscribe to professional regulatory standards, who engage in a process of education and training that is committed to anti-racist and anti-discriminatory principles, to radical critical theories, who by nature of their profession publicly sympathise with victims of injustice, support the principle of equality, and who as a profession we regard ourselves as being prejudiced, but we actually, in some cases, possess negative feelings, views and beliefs about Gypsy Roma traveller communities. We call that the aversive racism paradox. So we know racism is a multifaceted concept with colourblind racism, modern racism, symbolic racism, aversive racism, publicly profess sympathy. Yeah, you know, I can't be racist because I subscribe to these important codes of practice, but actually harbour negative feelings. Those 3 steps then. Al, did you want to come in and talk about those 3 steps? I'm just conscious I might be talking a bit too much.
There was a really good question, Dan, actually, and I think this is a pertinent place to pose it. So someone has said, I can understand bias. I can understand bias, you know, based on stereotypes, but what where there are legitimate, you know, concerns and evidence of domestic abuse.
Absolutely. So we have to respond to legitimate concerns about abuse and to protect children as our legal duty is. What we don't do is assume that that family's experience is the same for everybody within that ethnic group. In the same way that we experience and might deal with domestic violence with white British families, but we don't assume that every white British family is involved in domestic violence that requires our intervention. Understanding then the perception of the family, understanding then that the challenges that family face are multi-issue. Of course, domestic violence is an important topic, but we have to understand then how we can protect children and survivors of domestic abuse so that they can live a life where they are free from those bonds. And of course, the approaches that we might need to adopt with some communities is going to be very specific to their need, understanding then the challenges that exist around safeguarding functions, specific to that family, not generalized to assume a conceptual perception of all people within that ethnic group.
I think I was just going to add to that, Dan, that when you are undertaking, you have those statutory, duties and responsibilities. So when you're making, those legitimate, assessments as part of your statutory, duties, I think it's really important, to really keep checking out your biases, when you're exploring, strengths and capabilities within a family. So are you making different judgments because this family is is gypsy or traveller? So I think you have to work harder almost as a social worker to keep on going back and checking out your assessments and your analysis and your decision making. Would I make this if like you said, if this family wasn't gypsy, Roma and traveller? Would I see signs of safety? Would I see strengths that would mitigate and offset, and potentially lower some of the risks if this family weren't gypsy, Roma and traveller? So it's that constant, I think, checking out of those internal biases.
Yeah. So those steps then follow neatly on from Alison's points about 3 steps that we as a Gypsy Roma Traveller Association think are crucial. We need to start promoting the diversification of leadership within child protection systems. Of course, there are Gypsy Roma Traveller social workers, but maybe going back to the point that Alison made, reading from that point, the post on social media, maybe we might be working with colleagues who have Gypsy Roma Traveller heritage, but might be reluctant to share that because of the fear of persecution or racism. But how we understand then that there needs to be somebody who is engaged with communities, who can promote opportunities for community models of engagement within our decision-making systems. Recognizing, of course, that child protection is a multi-issue. Here, the importance of intersectionality is incredibly important. Understanding the effects of history, the effects of chronic social and structural discrimination, understanding the impact of potential bias and racism, and understanding the fact that some of our models of practice might not be suitably equipped to engage with communities to promote diversity in the way that we potentially should. The second one then, in terms of grassroots organising, how can we enable families who have experienced social work to talk about that experience, to be involved in the development of the social policies that affect their lives. Next slide, please.
I think that's our final slide, Dan, before we go to any questions at the end. So again, we said at the beginning that we now, in terms of some of the solutions moving forward, I think we really want the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Social Work Association to provide leadership to the profession in all social work with Gypsy, Roma and Traveller families, whether that's children, young people, adults or elders. We set up in June 2020, and we are comprised of community members and also social workers who are allies, who have clear demonstrable records of either research or working directly with the communities. We're very happy that Dan is a member of our association. We're as you are aware, I am the National Director of BASWA Cymru, and we are affiliated with BASWA. And again, we're looking at how cooperatively and collectively, we can support the aims of one another. We had the Gypsy Roma Traveller motion that went to the AGM last September, which puts responsibility by the members on BASWA to really change the way that social work happens within the communities. And the Gypsy Roma Traveller Social Work Association is very much at the head of leading what happens in relation, and how that motion becomes reality. Another really important reason for setting up was to have that that safe space for those of us who are from the communities and have been willing to be identified, to have a safe space, to have a peer space to support one another. But importantly, we want to be role models to community members, to young people, to say social work is a career for you. So part of our motivation is about role modeling excellent social work practice, evidence-based social work practice, but also social work as a positive career for community members. We have huge ambitions, Dan, don't we? But they are necessary and achievable ambitions. I mean, ultimately what we would like to do is to create really a paradigm shift in the way that social work happens within the communities, and to create new models of practice. But that's the long-term plan. Yeah. Is there anything you want to add to that, Dan?
No, that's fantastic. There's just maybe one question that I think ties that in nicely. That somebody suggested that Black, Asian, minority, ethnic social workers may be more able to offer ethnic sensitive interventions due to their experience and narratives. That of course what the Gypsy Roma Travel Association is doing is trying to diversify those leadership systems to make sure that Gypsy Roma Traveller people have a voice in those social policy systems. But I think then putting the responsibility on the Gypsy Roma Traveller Social Work Association and other Black, minority, ethnic social workers to affect and challenge institutional racism is a potential disparity, because we're arguably giving the most responsibility to those people in society who have the least power. Yeah. Instead then, well, let's take the advice from the what we know about ethnic sensitive practice, Spivak, Audre Lorde, understand the space and place of practice that can't just be dealt with by cultural competency training. This is about social workers understanding that they are experts in facilitating relationships and expert in understanding the lives of other people. What social workers do in one place should be directly transferable to another place. And if the social worker isn't able to do that, then we have to think seriously about our own education training and standards.
Absolutely. So I think that's all that's left to say really is a huge thank you for joining us today. I know that some resources and access to the Hidden Voices research and the videos that I spoke about earlier are now up on the BASWA website, and some other really important short videos which have community members again talking about the impact of discrimination and bullying and hate speech. So please go to the website and take a look at those resources and those videos as part of your ongoing education. And the further reading slide has just gone up, and we hope over the coming months to have a website so that we can have a central place for collating social work specific resources and research. So but we'll keep you informed of our developments as we go on, and I hope you have a good rest of the week and stay well and look after yourselves. Thank you very much.